Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 4th Annual Dahdaleh Global Health Graduate Scholars Symposium. My name is Professor Mary Viktorovich, and I'm the Acting Director of the Dahdaleh Institute for Global Health Research. Today, I'm delighted to present 4 accomplished graduate students. They will each be giving a short 10-minute presentation about the progress of their funded research projects and providing other insights about their research. As is our usual practice, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous land we're on. And as this is a hybrid event and some guests are on different territories, please take the time to give thanks and respect for the land on which you're currently living and working. So today I'm here in York University in Toronto, and we're situated on the traditional territorial area known as Tikaronto, and we acknowledge its current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We acknowledge this as the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wellington Belt Covenant and agreed to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So we have an exciting lineup today, but before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the contributions of all the Dahdaleh graduate scholars, including those who could not join us today. This symposium aims to showcase all the hard work all our graduate students put forth to furthering the field of global health research and addressing some of the most pressing global health challenges. And notably within our 3 themes at the Institute: planetary health, global health and humanitarianism, and global health foresighting. So thank you for all your contributions to all of our graduate students and for another wonderful academic year. So this is a 90-minute event that will end at 12:30, and we'll start with the first 4 presentations, followed by a 30-minute question, answer, and discussion session, wrapping up around 12:20. A few gentle reminders for our guests joining us online to please mute your microphone unless you're presenting or asking questions, and do note that we'll take comments and questions after the presentations. On that note, let's begin with our first speaker, Alexandra Scott. So Alex is a PhD student and a Social Science and Humanities Research Council doctoral fellow at Agbe Law School. Her work focuses on the development and deployment of autonomous weapons systems under international law and the role engineers play in both. Thank you, Alexandra. So should I introduce them all or just start with one at a time? Yeah. So Alexandra, if you would like to go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor. Hello, everyone. So my project is titled "The Myth of Good Enough." It's focused on law, engineering, and autonomous weapon systems. My name is Alexandra Scott, and I have the pleasure of being a Dahdaleh Global Health Graduate Scholar in the field of global health and humanitarianism. And I'm supervised by Professor Satrishi Bandapatiai, who is also a faculty fellow in global health and humanitarianism. So just to give a bit of an overview and contextualize my research topics include artificial intelligence, autonomous weapon systems, which are a type of emerging AI technology that's capable of essentially performing its essential functions, including targeting, identification, and pursuit of a given target autonomously, that is, without human intervention or oversight. So you may have also heard them referred to as killer robots, slaughter bots, or lethal autonomous weapons, which is or laws, which is a slightly extended epithet to refer to the fact that these are capable of performing lethal functions without human oversight. As a PhD student over at Osgoode Hall Law School, I'm also including law in my dissertation, and the areas include international humanitarian law, or laws of war, international criminal law, international human rights law, and some domestic and transnational legal structures such as employment law. And then lastly is I deal in professional legal ethics, because the main focus of my research is not necessarily the autonomous weapon systems themselves and their legality or lack of legality thereof, but instead the people making them. And in this case, it is the engineers. So the main I trained as an engineer. It's all coming from within inside the house. If it makes you feel better. So,
I just gave him a deep penetrating.
um, so the purpose of my research is to trace autonomous weapon systems through the path of their development through to deployment. The methodology I'm using to do so is an adapted engineering methodology, and it's called life cycle analysis. Traditionally, life cycle analysis is used to determine the total environmental impact that a given technology will have, from basically, not to be too glib, but womb to tomb. How is it created? How is it used? And then how, after the fact, is it dealt with when it is no longer a viable technology and needs to be retired? So I've adapted it to instead look at what I'm going to call decision nodes. So the moments of significant legal and ethical concerns are implicated along this pathway, whether it's deciding how a given autonomous weapon system will be able to identify and target a specific person, what kind of weapons are being used, at what point are engineers making decisions that could implicate some kind of legal concern. And then I'm also going to be looking at the legal, social, political, and technical context that frame this pathway, because these engineers aren't creating killer robots in a vacuum. And so rather than contribute to what I think is such a robust area of research, which would be whether they're legal, whether they should be created, I've decided to instead look at the reality of the fact that they exist and what engineers have done and are doing to not only develop them, but develop them more rapidly to behave more autonomously. Because they have been deployed. And here is an example of an autonomous weapon system that has been deployed. It's the Cargo 2. It's developed in Turkey by Turkish military assets. And in March 2021, a UN panel of experts on Libya identified it as the potential first instance of an autonomous weapon system being deployed in combat. It was programmed to attack targets without requiring data connectivity between the operator and the munition. In effect, a true fire, forget, and find capability. Here, fire means the deployment of the Cargo 2 itself, where it's able to forget its connectivity point. It has all the information it needs, and using data processing, machine learning, it is able to identify and find its target. Whether or not it actually applied lethal force independently of human interaction is unknown. And the report is itself silent on whether or not they feel that international law has been broken or not. It's a reality. We're dealing in a world of reality when we discuss autonomous weapon systems. And this is one of the most common questions I get is, what are autonomous weapon systems? Because we've spent so long dealing in a world of science fiction. A lot of people ask me about the Terminator movies. A lot of people ask me about, I think, Blade Runner. I haven't seen them all. But it's because there's so much in science fiction that captures the mind that people don't really understand what they actually look like and what their actual capabilities are. These are not super intelligent beings. They are autonomous robots. They are artificially intelligent, but they are being trained on data sets that are fallible, and they are breaking what I believe to be one of the fundamental values underpinning international humanitarian law and international criminal law. And that's that while engineers have always been a driver of war, it has always been at an arm's length. They have
It's always been what?
at an arm's length. So they've created weapon systems that can be deployed, but they are not the ones to deploy them. There's not a direct tie between the engineer and an act that results in a fatality, typically. Even if it's machine malfunctions, because things only need to operate within a certain degree of certainty, it is not the engineer's fault. They did not intend for that to happen. But in this case, there's a direct connection between what an engineer intends to happen and what will ultimately happen, because that autonomous weapon system is essentially, and there's a direct relationship between the engineer and the system that will then go on to potentially commit an unlawful killing. So this doesn't really align with what I believe to be some of the core principles of international criminal law and the laws of war, which is that individuals must take responsibility for their actions. There's something called command responsibility, where even if you're commanded to go commit a crime, you have a responsibility to say, no, I will not commit that crime. And duress is not an excuse to say, oh, I was pressured into committing this crime and killing those people. It's not a defense under international criminal law. So there's this idea that while humans operate under the fog of war, which is an understandable circumstance where they are just buffeted by the intense psychological, emotional, physical pressures of war, that they might not make the best decision. It is ultimately that human that is responsible for that decision being made. Bring in autonomous weapon systems, and suddenly you have something that cannot accept responsibility for its actions, being allowed to make the same decisions that we already don't monitor enough. We have the structures in place to prosecute those who commit unlawful acts during war. It doesn't always happen. And now we have something that will result in that happening even less. And that these decisions and these research components taken, these research, the design decisions, the deployment decisions, only some of those are engineers responsible for. An engineer can't choose to deploy their weapon. Someone must deploy it for them. But the fact that at that point, from the point of deployment on, the drone will be relying on solely what the engineer has trained it to do is a deep concern to me. Because even if it's functioning properly and it's performing within its band of tolerances, individuals will still die who shouldn't die, who are going to be unlawfully killed. That is very much the likely outcome of autonomous weapon systems deployment in the 21st century, because the systems we have simply aren't good enough. A lot of, for example, visual recognition software is incapable of accurately identifying individuals from racialized background, particularly those who have darker skin. It just can't identify them as accurately as, say, a white man. White men have, image recognition software for white men tend to have accuracy rates in the high 90s. But especially for women of color, the percentages drop quite significantly. So even if this is being deployed, quote unquote, lawfully in an area where it would be appropriate to do so, we don't have a guarantee that those who will be targeted are actually going to be lawful targets under the laws of war, and that we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. And under the laws of war, there is some, I don't want to say wiggle room, but there's some understanding that there will always be civilians who unfortunately are collateral damage. But the question being asked it's a question of proportionality. Did the military objective outweigh, or was it significantly valuable enough to somehow justify the loss of those civilian deaths? When you're dealing with very highly targeted software and systems such as those found on autonomous weapon systems, the question becomes, what is allowable collateral damage? Because collateral damage is the deaths of non-military objectives is also, it's a reflective of the fact that in war, sometimes you have to make a decision to save your own life over somebody else's. The cargo too arguably doesn't have a life to save. And it also ties into the research theme that I'm delighted to be a part of, which is global health humanitarianism, because this will have a very real impact on the health systems in the regions in which it's deployed. Because what is death but the absence of health? There are people who are going to be dying who shouldn't have to die. So that's primarily the focus of my research, is what are the engineers doing? What decisions are they making? What promises are they making? What decisions are they being empowered to make when they shouldn't? Particularly since engineering can be such a siloed profession, and a lot of engineers do not have a working knowledge of their legal obligations, the legal requirements for the products that they're designing and deploying, and kind of pulling them out of their silos and saying, this is the very real situation that could result from your work. and you should be aware of it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. So our next speaker is Caroline Duncan. Perfect. So Caroline is a PhD candidate at the Lassonde School of Engineering. Using an interdisciplinary and participatory approach, her research analyzes the factors affecting the accessibility and quality of Arctic drinking water. So over to you.
Oh, I should actually say something. Okay, cool. Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm just going to be talking about, well, a small little nugget of the project, and this is on the water quality data that was provided from the government of Nunavut on Cambridge Bay, and then kind of looking at the gaps and next steps that I'll be taking. So this is kind of basically just trying to see where we are at with Cambridge Bay's information before moving into that participatory stage of including the residents and the government and NGO stakeholders. So just a little introduction. So Cambridge Bay is it's pretty high up there. It's about 69 degrees north, up in the Arctic Circle on Victoria Island in Nunavut. It's known as the Vancouver of the North and is home to about 2,000 residents. It's also got the Canadian High Arctic Research Center or Station. If you have time to Google it, I highly recommend. It's a very beautiful building with some extremely high doors for whales. It's cool. I recommend it. Anyway, a bit more about their water system. So Cambridge Bay is a little bit different in comparison to the other communities. So they are owned by the municipality, but it's operated by CGS. And they have both predominantly truck system, but also a small utilidor section. So that goes from the CHARS building, the hospital, the high school, and some other municipal buildings. They have a filtration, UV, and chlorination. And although they do have coagulation available, it's not in use due to it causing corrosion issues. And back in 2021, Dillon Consulting performed across the territory these water quality reports for the RCMP. And they found that within 2018 to 2020, that there was exceedances in turbidity and THMs and an aesthetic objective exceedances for aluminium and magnesium. And within a 2-month period in 2020, they found that the free residual chlorine was below the regulation of 0.2 milligrams per liter, a total of 37 times. So more than 1 month, they were not meeting their minimum regulation. So the data that was provided was from WaterTrack's data management. It is not the best management site I've ever used. And for that, after kind of cleaning it up, we decided to split this into 2 subsets to kind of see if we could see some trends. And so these 2 subsets was 2017 to 2021 to look at annual trends. So the reason we only kept the data from April, May, June is because this was the most consistent sampling time, whilst the other sampling events just weren't consistent, so not considered to do this annual trend. And then from 2022 to 2023, there is a lot more consistency, so this was good for a seasonal trend. The parameters that we looked at, or you can use your eyeballs, but we're going to focus in on DOC, copper, and manganese. So once the data was finally cleaned, we kind of thought, okay, what are the sort of questions that we want to ask looking at this historic data set? And so again, I do have these questions up, so I'm just going to dive in. So is the water quality different at different points in the system, and is the treatment helping? So in the 2017 to 2021 data set, excuse me, we found that there was a significant difference between locations, with 95% confidence for pH, copper, and zinc. And throughout the different years, there was significant difference in locations for manganese, turbidity, and DOC. And then in the 2022 to 2023, again, we saw copper and manganese in the locations. And then when we looked at the monthly changes for the trucks only, we saw zinc, copper, manganese, and DOC. So this is from the 2017 to 2021 data set for copper. And we had a little bit of a rogue sampling site at the high school, which isn't usually performed from government sampling, but really quite helpful for us to see that there's something going on at the high school, whether that's due to their plumbing or there's corrosive water, we don't know, but it gave us an insight that maybe we need to start looking into the buildings to see what sort of plumbing they have and what chemicals or metals they're being exposed to. Manganese here, so was the treatment plant working? So the new treatment plant was put in 2017, and if you look at the lake on the left-hand side, you can see that from 2017 to 2021, there's some variation. But with the treatment plant and the truck, after 2017, it decreases dramatically, meaning that the treatment plant has basically done its job. We then wanted to look at water quality changing over time and if it was seasonal or long term. Unfortunately, there just was not enough data to perform a man candle. However, when we look at the graphs that are coming up next, it does look like there could be potential changes. So this was, again, manganese from 2022 to this year. We had to remove the June 2023 data point because it was so abnormal that it was like, this must be wrong or part of a different community. And what we actually found out is they had decided to sample from the lakeside instead of their intake line tap, which they usually sample from. So even just looking at, okay, what data are you going to be collecting, and is it actually helpful or useful when you're trying to build a baseline of the community's source water? When we looked at the DOC, again, we saw these monthly trends, or seasonal trends, I should say, with March and June during spring freshet showing higher DOC than September and December. And when we look back from the 2017 to 2021, again, we're seeing the lake treatment plant and truck all around that 9 milligrams per liter. Again, that data was taken between April, May, and June. So that's spring freshet times. So that's in line with what we're expecting to see seasonally. The reason it's remaining so high, though, is because the community is taking the coagulation offline due to corrosion. Then we wanted to see what water quality parameters were correlated. And so iron turbidity, manganese turbidity, and manganese and iron all had a higher of 0.7 on the Spearmint rank in the 2017 to 2021. And again, in 2022 to 2023, we had THM, DOC, copper, zinc, and iron zinc. But the one that I really want to focus in on now is the THM over the DOC. So this is quite normal and expected. Hooray for water behaving how we expect it to. So with higher DOC, we would expect to see increase in THMs as the organic carbon is reacting with the disinfectant. However, what is an issue is, although it's not currently regulated in Nunavut, this red line is the maximal allowable concentration. And so a lot of these data points here are above that MAC. And so when new regulations in Nunavut do come into effect, the government and municipality are going to have to look into different solutions to ensure that this is decreased around the 6 milligrams per liter of DOC. So some of the gaps, obviously we saw really high elevated levels of copper closing in on the MAC as a random sample. I don't believe there's any further investigations that's taking place into this, which is concerning to me personally. But so that's one gap that we want to look into. Additionally, alternative sources. So at the moment, a lot of Inuit people just go take ice from the lake. And so it's completely untreated. They have no idea what's in it, but it tastes better for their cups of tea. So it would be interesting to see what are they exposing themselves to potentially. The residential properties, particularly the cisterns and the taps, again, going back to the high school, this is just to see the internal plumbing of the buildings, particularly the old buildings. Seeing if CHARS has their own sampling data, because they are a research facility. And then looking at the GN, sort of government of Nunavut and municipal buildings that are both connected and not connected to the utilidor. So next steps is obviously speaking with community members to identify areas of concern for testing. And from this, we'll be doing a full water quality analysis to not just identify additional areas of concern, but to see if anything that's being picked up in the historic data set to see if it's still a problem. So these are just some lovely individuals that I would like to acknowledge. Madeline Cole is my main contact up in Cambridge Bay, as well as Jim McEachran, Jamie Tapana, and the Continuing Heritage Society, which would be really helpful to allow this work to happen. So, you don't need to see this one, you'll ask later.
Thank you, Caroline. So our next speaker is Eyram Agbe. I'm not sure, am I pronouncing that right? Yeah, okay, so she's a master's student at the Development Studies program, and her research seeks to understand the diverse psychosocial impacts of COVID-19 on basic school teachers in Accra, Ghana, and how these factors affect their ability to support new curriculum implementation. So over to you, Agbe.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Eyram, and this will be a brief agenda for today. So this is my research question: to what extent does the psychosocial impact of COVID affect Ghanaian basic school teachers' capacity to navigate ICT and education reforms? And I'm focusing on public school teachers, and I'm just trying to understand the relationship between the compounding stresses that teachers have had to endure during the pandemic, and its impact on their capacity to fully participate in agenda setting for the new curriculum reforms. So very briefly, the policy framework for education in Ghana is quite complex. It's ever-changing, and it kind of intersects with the policy provisions for emergency management in Ghana. So in Ghana, the Ministry of Education initiates policy, the Ghana Education Service implements pre-tertiary education policy. There's the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, which was initially an advisory board under the Ghana Education Service, but it's now a council under the Ministry of Education. There's an ICT and education policy from 2015, and then there's an education strategic plan for 2018 and 2030. The policy provisions for emergency management in Ghana are very diverse, and this comes with its issues. So for one, there's the NADMO, as we call it, National Disaster Management Organization. It's very cross-ministerial. There's ministers and stakeholders from every single ministry in Ghana, which is kind of funny because every new government comes and creates a new ministry. So it's like, who is really sitting on the committee? And this disaster management model focuses on defining and managing the risk environment and also responding to threats. But disaster management remains ad hoc. It's also concentrated at the national level and it only responds to events. So we also have a series of plans, policies for climate change action. And these are being developed in conjunction with international development organizations like the UNDP, the World Bank, and funding is coming from the World Bank predominantly. Ghana is known for creating amazing policies, numerous policies, but we have very weak legislative and regulatory frameworks, and there's also poorly defined allocation of responsibility for key outcomes. Decentralization is a big thing in our constitution, but then metropolitan, municipal, and district assemblies are not adequately empowered to contribute to climate change resilience. And there is significant overlap in coordination across ministries. So when you look across these climate change documents, for instance, it's unclear who is supposed to be responsible for what. So those are some of the key issues. There's little integration. There's also financing that remains a challenge, and action also remains ad hoc. Before I got to the field, I was thinking about disasters in Ghana very broadly, and I interned with an organization called Africa Education Watch in April. And I was developing a framework for equity in education disaster response for them. And they really encouraged me to think about disasters in the context of schools in Ghana. And I got to know that every single year there's a series of specific disasters that impacts schools and school communities in the country. So for one, there's fires, there's school collapses, and the school collapses are especially significant because there's a pot of money at the district level and at the national level that's supposed to go to infrastructure development. But that allocation has been reduced significantly over the past 4 years. And we currently have about 5,000 schools under trees and about 425,000 JHS students who study under trees in our country. Floods are also an issue every single year, especially in the northeastern part of Ghana, where I come from, because Burkina Faso, which is a neighboring country, opens its dam every year to drain it, and that impacts communities along the Volta River as well. So school is regularly disrupted for students and their communities in these areas. And the knock-on effect of this is students having to go to school in canoes. And in some communities, it's routine for children to go to school in canoes, and you often see like kindergarten kids paddling canoes. It's a very harrowing sight. And just when I started interning with the organization, they were actually responding to an event where 12-year-old and I think a 13-year-old had died in a capsized canoe as well. So it's a regular thing that happens every year, but then there's no targeted action to address the school-specific disaster risk profile in the country. So the context for this study is, I call it an unfortunate perfect storm. The new standards-based curriculum was launched in September 2019. So we see where this is going in regards to COVID. So basic school education is now inclusive of senior high school. So there are 5 new key stages. There's an emphasis on performance standards rather than objectives. And the government's philosophy is classrooms should be learner-centered and schools should be teacher-centered, which is an issue for me because how do you reconcile that at an institutional level? And one of the key goals of the curriculum is ICT being a critical tool in dialogic learning environments to achieve STEM goals. And STEM goals are seen as the perks of the entire curriculum. So it's defined as a precondition of success across the national curriculum. However, basic schools were shut down in March of 2020. Sorry, that should be 2020, and only fully returned in January of 2021, but final exam candidates came back to school in June of 2020. And the significant deficiencies in school infrastructure became very, very apparent. And teachers and school staff became de facto health workers because there were no health workers allocated to schools. They basically had to take up the responsibility of making sure toilets were working, providing masks, providing hand sanitizers, all of that stuff to students. And EdTech and techno-optimism became very powerful discursive tools in the wake of the pandemic. There were conversations about using phones, platforms, and other interventions to ensure that students had a sense of normalcy during the pandemic. So I decided to focus on public schools specifically because during the pandemic, public school teachers were still paid their salaries. And people would normally think this would kind of erase any kind of vulnerability that they had. But for me, it was important to analyze their social vulnerability because I think a key part of social vulnerability is a social history, which is checkered in the public school sector. So there are environmental factors like inadequate toilet facilities, non-availability of desks, the kidney rides, as I mentioned, that don't just disappear because of a social protection measure, and the social political contentions around them don't just disappear. And also, like, teachers' sensitivity to COVID and response to COVID does not automatically disappear by the provision of economic support. So with this study, I was kind of trying to push beyond these pre-made assumptions and explanations about how teachers navigated the new responsibilities that they had during the pandemic, and also kind of understanding how the significant burden of work that they had to carry impacted them during and after the pandemic. There's also a very significant gap in the research on mental health impacts of teachers in Ghana. So very quickly, I decided to use the interpretative phenomenological approach, which is very interesting. I got to find out that phenomenological philosophers really like to beef with each other. That was fun to experience as someone who had never used the methodology before, but it was really, really insightful for me to use this methodology because I didn't want to create generalizable findings. I just wanted to understand where are you coming from mentally? How did this impact you mentally then? And how is this impacting you mentally now? I was also interested in emphasizing the historical, contextual, and political forces and working on participants. So two defining features for me in the study were hagiography, so analyzing individual cases, and double hermeneutics, so making sense of how researchers make sense of things. So it was crucial for me to understand this because teachers taught different subjects. I wasn't interviewing teachers who taught the same subjects. So they had different experiences. And hagiography for me was important in understanding the similarities and convergences in every case. Fieldwork was very interesting. I had to get institutional approval. I also had to navigate gatekeeper access because something that came up a lot was education is being politicized now. And I spoke to a head teacher and I was like, hey, I'd like to interview at your school. And she was like, oh yeah, sure. I later went back to her after not hearing back for a month. And she said, oh, I thought you wanted to interview just me. And I was like, no, I want to interview your teachers. And I think that was just to buy time to see whether she really wanted to give me access or not. I collected data between June and August of 2023. It was a qualitative, semi-structured interview. And I also had other research-related tasks like getting us access to secondary data, which was immensely difficult in Ghana. I still don't have some data I asked for, which is fun. And some of the other challenges involve not getting access to parents who I initially wanted to include in the study. And in addition to that, I volunteered with Africa Education Watch, which was one of the best experiences of my fieldwork because I got to speak to stakeholders from Oxfam and Action Aid who work a lot in education in Ghana. And I got to see things from the perspective of donors and people working to create policy with the government. So for my data analysis, IPA is so time consuming, but I love that it's time consuming. So I had to first make experiential statements, just describing initial thoughts, then exploratory notes, which was the first level of analysis, personal experiential themes, which was general themes from each transcript, and then the group experiential themes, which is like the analysis overall. So some of my findings, and this is subject to change as I continue to go through the transcripts, but participants had a really complex relationship with social contracts and health in their status as workers employed by the government. They were very uneasy about the provision of salaries and they were hesitant to talk about this because they conceptualized their time at home as relaxation, rest, and doing nothing but teaching. And when I probed them about this, I found that there was a sense of guilt about being paid. But then it was also undercut by betrayal at the fact that there was no attention paid to the pre-existing conditions characterizing the nature of their work. So this caused a lot of angst with some participants who suggested, and this is like a direct quote, that the government has to maintain us as teachers so that we can return to the classroom after COVID. And I think this quote stood out to me because it just captured very beautifully what a lot of participants were struggling to say. And I think the word maintain kind of suggests a continuous adherence to the promises that are made to teachers in relation to health-related tasks, specifically the recognition of the fact that the impacts of COVID had brought a lot of damage on their ability to maintain themselves. Also suggests reliance on the public health system, that kind of belies reality, because on average, the teachers I interviewed would earn about 3,000 cedis on average, which is about 400 Canadian dollars, but the National Health Insurance Scheme only pays about 17% of expenses. So that was like a complicated relationship with that. There was also ongoing stress about the fact that they had to plan for something, but nobody really knew what they were planning for, because someone told me, oh, like Ghanaians live on daily mood. So it's like anything that can happen at any time, but we don't really know what we are planning for. And also teachers' health needs were not static, but then the government's posture towards their health needs was all like, your health needs are just, you need masks and hand sanitizer and all of that stuff. So the impact of that was there were certain mental heuristics that they used to navigate the responsibility of teaching and learning ICT. A lot of them saw health and recovery as external to their work, and there were issues with buying into the vision of discourse of the state in regards to teaching ICT in their subjects. So these are some of my recommendations, and in the interest of time, I'll put these as well. And thank you to the Dahdaleh Institute. It was really reassuring to do my research and not have to worry too much about like the plane ticket to Ghana. My participants in Ghana as well, and also the Development Studies MA program, which has always been supportive through my research. So thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. Our next speaker is Nawang Yanga. And Nawang is a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Health. Her work focuses on the lived experiences of Tibetan refugees in India with tuberculosis, TB, in Indian settlements from a social perspective.
Thank you
So
so
over
much.
to you.
Yeah, so I'm Nawang. I'm a second year PhD student, under the supervision of the most inspiring, Dr. Amrita Doctorate. So before beginning, I'd like to thank the Institute for providing us this space to, present even at the earliest of our research stages. Okay, yeah. And for allowing me to be a graduate scholar for 2 years of my PhD now. So I'm really thankful for the Institute for that. I'd like to make a few disclaimers. The first is that I am in the beginning stages of my work, so I don't have results, but I am going to start with some background information and my proposed research project. And the second is that my presentation rarely, if at all, touches on TB in the clinical sense. I'd rather shine a light on the bigger aspect, which is displacement and refugeeism, and what it means to be a refugee, a Tibetan refugee in India today. And lastly, I thought initially I'd steer away from adding anything political, but I think it's almost impossible to talk about the TB situation in the Tibetan refugees in India without first talking about the series of events that unfolded, which led to the displacement of thousands of Tibetans into India, Nepal, Bhutan, and the world now. But this is my perspective, so I encourage you to find your own answers and do your own research online or the rest of So after almost a decade of Chinese occupation, in 1959, there was an uprising that took place in front of the Potala Palace in Lhasa, Tibet. The Potala Palace is the winter residence for the Dalai Lama. And this was in response to a collective rumor or belief that the Chinese government was planning an assassination attempt on the Dalai Lama. So there was violence from both sides. Thousands of lives were lost, monasteries destroyed. Obviously, we were in Tibet where this fight was happening. But after a few days or weeks of battle, the Tibetan troops surrendered because the People's Liberation Army was destroying them. But on the 17th of March, the Dalai Lama and his entourage escaped towards India. And on the 26th of March, the Dalai Lama set up a provisional government in the southern region of Tibet, which is important now, and you'll see later on, but it was there that he penned a letter to then President of India, Nehru, to basically informally ask for permission to be led into India. And he was given permission. On the 31st of March of 1959, he was led into India. He was allowed into India. After that, 80,000 Tibetans followed Dalai Lama to India on foot across the Himalayas. And this marked the first wave of Tibetans fleeing into India. However, over time, less and less Tibetans make their journey towards India just because of harsher crackdowns at the border. And now there are Tibetans all over the world, across all continents globally, but in the regions that are closer to Tibet, so in India, Nepal, and Bhutan, there are 44 Tibetan settlements that are where the Indian government basically provided land for Tibetans to settle in. Although these settlements are headed by settlement officers by the Tibetan exiled government, the Indian government has ultimate authority over what happens in this land. I'm not too sure about the situation in Nepal and Bhutan, but just to kind of give you some context about how I came into this topic, I was born in Swambhu in Nepal. It's one of the Tibetan settlements, and I lived there for 6 years of my life. And growing up, I heard about TB quite often, and it was spoken about in such a casual and in a casual manner that at one point I truly did believe that everyone knew about TB or had TB, and that TB was just a very casual, very everyday illness. And I think this experience is quite common in the Tibetan diaspora. My mom had TB when she was pregnant with my older sister, so at that point, that didn't seem too startling to me. And it wasn't until I came to Canada, and maybe even 8 to 10 years later, where I was reintroduced to TB when I had to do a volunteer gig at Sick Kids. And even then, I didn't kind of put the two and two together, that the same TB test that I was taking was a TB that we Tibetans speak so casually about. And I think that says a lot to the privilege that we have here in Canada. And truthfully, I didn't think critically of this topic until I started my master's under the supervision of Dr. Dahdaleh, where I realized the severity and urgency of the disparity that TB represents globally. And so all of these experiences led me to where I am now in the pursuit of a better understanding of the TB crisis in the Tibetan community. So these 44 settlements are governed by the Tibetan parliament or government in exile, situated in Dharamsala, India, which is in the northern region of India. This is known as the Central Tibetan Administration, or the CTA, which I will now refer to. And it is, quote, a continuation of the government of an independent Tibet. It is a registered non-profit political organization in India, whereby leaders are democratically elected to sort of govern the Tibetan diaspora globally. However, it is not recognized as an actual government by any state as a formal governing body, but it's instead validated by the Tibetan people. It's self-reliant, it's self-sufficient. Again, you still have to follow the rules of the host that you are in. So it's a state within a state. So there are 7 departments, including but not limited to education, health, religion. They have schools for refugee children, they have hospitals, clinics, and these obviously do lack funding, and so we often look to international donors for help. And so that's that image on top of the top right is an image of Tibetans in India voting for the welfare officer of the CTA, and on the bottom right is an image of the Tibetan parliament exile. Yeah. So in one of the more in one of the regions where Tibetans stay, in Dharamsala exists Dahdaleh Hospital, which I think is the major hospital and the major TB clinic, which was created in the 1980s, due to the TB issue. And this is where I'd like to conduct my fieldwork, this and the surrounding areas. These images are of Dahdaleh Hospital, but also on the top right is of Dr. Kuncho Proji, the one with the glasses. On the stethoscope. He's a physician and a professor at Johns Hopkins, and he's spearheaded quite a few programs and campaigns to address the TB issue in refugee settlements. And I'd say that the Tibetan government and the Tibetan people know collectively that TB is a very prominent public health issue. For example, the Department of Health does have a TB control program that they spearhead. But like I said earlier, I won't speak about TB itself too much, but just to briefly introduce TB, it's an airborne infectious disease, impacts mainly the lungs, but can virtually impact all organs of the body. There's treatment, it's curable, it's treatable, but low to middle income countries like India always almost account for the highest TB burden. And within India, the pocketed community of Tibetan refugees has consistently shown a higher TB rate than even considered relative to the Indian population. And these rates tend to be higher in monasteries, nunneries, boarding schools, for obvious reasons of overcrowding. And the number of years you live in the settlements is positively correlated with the risk of TB. And so is precarious employment, like sweater selling and being unemployed. So much of this information is explored at a very surface level, but I like to go deeper by speaking to people and not necessarily relying on information that you can gather from a survey, although important. Despite these numbers, there's very little literature that exists, and those that do are often epidemiological and rarely consider the historical, social, and political context of which the Tibetan people exist and how there's a space existed for TB to thrive. I think displacement is rarely considered, which I think is central to this topic. But I think one of the biggest gaps that I've found here is that in TB discourses of what it means to be a refugee, particularly in the Indian context. As we know, being a refugee has great implication on one's health. You can find stuff online or read, like I said. But then there's also great precarity and anxiousness that comes with being a refugee, despite being quote unquote welcomed to a state. And so I like to explore how this impacts the Tibetan people and how this has led to the TB issue impacting the Tibetan people so greatly. And the reason why I put the asterisk there is because in India, the overwhelming majority of Tibetan people are considered foreigners, which in India, you're either a foreigner or a citizen, or they simply lack a defined legal status and they just exist illegally. So refugee becomes a self-serving identity rather than a legal status. And this is also because India is not party to the 1951 Refugee Convention nor the 67 Protocol and doesn't really have a national framework to protect refugees. So instead, most refugees hold registration certificates, which are basically identification papers that signify that you are a foreigner in India. But being titled a foreigner rather than a citizen or a refugee even has great limitations on employment, education, land ownership, etc. So for example, I've heard stories of Tibetan academics not being able to hold positions in higher education because they simply lack the qualification of being a Tibetan, being an Indian citizen, or just needing to pay more for education fees just because you don't hold the Indian citizenship. So there are downhill impacts of this precarity in legal status that I think definitely does impact TB, but this has yet to be explored. And I'd say that the relationship between the Tibetan people and the Indian government and the Indian people is generally good, and that the Indian state is aware that there are many Tibetans who lack the legal paperwork, but there's a sort of unsaid acceptance of this. But that could change at any time. Again, the precarity, that anxiousness aspect, given India's arbitrary stance on refugees, and maybe possibly improvement in the relationship between India and China. And I think if this does happen, I think it's going to be really detrimental to the Tibetan people, as we see in Nepal, in the case where there's been India, Nepal, and China have been there's a improvement in their relationship, and that has definitely impacted the Tibetan people and how they collectively sort of live. And at any point, the Indian government could just crack down on these refugees and send them back to Chinese-occupied Tibet. They could face jail time, fees. So there's very awkward tension there, and there's much to explore there. So like I said, I'm not too interested in TB in the clinical aspect. I'd rather talk to the people, get to know their stories, and sort of approach this qualitatively. And so some of the things that I'd like to explore are things like employment. I'd like to know how the TB diagnosis maybe impacted their sweater selling business, for months they travel across India and sell sweaters and clothing on footpaths, and how perhaps taking time away from this job led to further financial strain. I'd like to know why they even took on jobs as sweater sellers in the first place, and if there isn't enough opportunity for them within India to take on other jobs. And I'd also like to know how TB impacted women in balancing roles as being a mother, a caretaker, a wife, an entrepreneur, and having to take time away from home for months. On the left is an image I found online, which shows Tibetan entrepreneurs hiding from municipal authorities in Mumbai and India, who are kind of becoming stricter on refugees who sell these clothes and sweaters across major cities in India. Again, engaging in such precarious jobs is something that comes with the foreigner status, and also I think definitely has impact on the TB diagnosis itself. I think it's a pretty cyclical thing here. But I also want to know if they turn to TB clinics or Tibetan medicine centers, otherwise known as Mensekang. I want to know how treatment has been and if they've been having any difficulty following treatment. But these are just some of the curiosities that I have, and I think is rooted in my understanding as a Tibetan person. And that's often missed because much of what we see in TB discourse, particularly in the Tibetan community, is not authored or led by Tibetan scholars. So there's a lot that you miss when you aren't in that community. So my research project is very ambitious, but I'm confident that it'll all work out, and I'll hopefully be back at Dahdaleh if I'm given the chance to share any updates. But It'll take place in Dharamsala in India, the northern region, like I said, in Dahdaleh Hospital and the surrounding areas. I'd like to speak with adults who are undergoing treatment for TB. And prior to any field work, I'd like to have consultation with community leaders and organizations, just to sort of have a better understanding of how to approach things. I think I'd like to include the Tibetan people in the entirety of my research, from creating interview guides, from finding appropriate locations for observation and interviews. I just think as a Tibetan person, this is important to me, and as an academic, I think it's very important for me to have this aspect added to my research. So like I mentioned, I'd be having interviews and observing people in places of worship, hospitals, schools, social events, gatherings. Ultimately, I'd like to just shed light on lived experiences and nuances that are missed and not yet explored at all in this discourse. So these are some of the research questions I'd like to ask them. These are like not all of them, just something that I've been coming up with. About lived experiences and social challenges they've been facing, how the illness has been affecting their activities of daily living, any stigma encounters they've had, how they navigate the issues that they're facing, and if they're receiving any support, both from their community and from the government, actually, the Tibetan government that's in Dharamsala, in close proximity to the people at Dahdaleh Hospital. And I'd like to ask if they've ever thought about their position as refugees, quote unquote, but how that's been affecting their TB experience and just living in India overall. So my goal is to work alongside the CTA, the Central Tibetan Administration, the Tibetan government, exiled government, to just create policies and programming and to bring new perspectives into the policy models that already exist. I'd like to, empower other Tibetans to act as advocates, activists, and to tell their stories. And overall, the main idea here is that TB is greater than just TB. And this is also a vessel for me to speak about Tibet and the issues happening in Tibet. So I think this is a way for me to keep the Tibetan struggle alive. And I leave you with some beautiful images of Dharamsala that I found online in the Washington Post. That's it. Thank you again to this institute and to everyone here and everyone on Zoom for listening. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Nawang, and to all of the presenters today. Some very exciting projects that you're all have started and are launching. So I think they'll provide some great discussion. And perhaps Nawang, I could just start with you in terms of, you mentioned as, foreigner status in India. What sort of access to healthcare would
that's something that I also want to explore as well. I think one interesting thing that I did talk about is whether or not they access the Indian hospitals, Indian state-run hospitals, both public and private, or if they turn to Tibetan medicine or a combination of both.
Right.
I know that most Tibetans, from just my sort of experiences, we tend to turn towards private institutions in India and Nepal for healthcare, and that does come with out-of-pocket costs. So that's what
It's
my
just
insight is so
your
far.
initial but you'll find out more
Oh
as
yeah,
you
definitely.
delve more deeply. Yeah, great. All right. Well, at this point, we'd like to open it up to questions. So both online or those who are here as well. Go ahead.
Hi, great job, Nawang. Hi, everyone. Sorry I can't be there, but hope to see you in about an hour. Looks like, sorry. I just got an auto response from Zoom. Nawang, I was curious about, if you plan to work in Dharamsala, working with a community that is in some ways obliged to the Indian government, and at the same time, you're thinking about a fairly critical analysis as you go forward, and how you think this will, I don't know, disrupt or support your engagement with the Tibetan community in Dharamsala.
Yeah, I think the topic of responsibility, particularly from the Indian state, their responsibility to perhaps help the Tibetan people. I think that's a very awkward space there. The fact that Tibetan people have been sort of led into India and welcomed, I think there's a certain level of gratitude and gratefulness, but at the same time, I did highlight these nuances and these disparities there. So I think I will have a difficult time because of this, and I do acknowledge that. And I think throughout the journey, hopefully I find ways to navigate these awkward tensions there. Because, like I mentioned, the Tibetan government is a state within a state, not formally recognized by any nation as a actual government. And so, yeah, it has to be it's a personal journey as well as a Tibetan person, recognizing this awkwardness there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Emily, for the question. Hillary, would you like to go ahead?
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, sorry I couldn't be there in person, but it's been a pleasure to listen to all four of you on Zoom. So thank you very much. My question is for Alexandra. Sorry, I'm a little sick. I really enjoyed your presentation. I think it's fascinating. Maybe I didn't pick up on it, or I'm not an expert, so I don't understand. But I really appreciated the methodology that you spoke about in terms of the life cycle approach, life cycle assessment. And I understood how you were kind of trying to use that to identify kind of inflection points along the cycle from a legal perspective. I'm wondering, in your methodology, are you looking at a specific case or a specific example that you're going to be following through? I'm saying this because this topic is incredibly pertinent right now, especially with what's happening in Israel-Palestine. And there's been a lot of conversation around the use of AI recently in that conflict. So I wonder, yeah, how are you contextualizing this and where are you looking towards?
Thank you so much for your question. I hope you feel better soon.
Thank you.
It's more of a generalized evaluation because there are a variety of different autonomous weapon systems that exist. The example I gave is just one of them. Mm-hmm. There are various configurations that they can take. One of the ones that's being produced by a military manufacturer in Australia, it's basically, it looks like a battle bot, like a sledge battle bot, if any of you have watched battle bots. Oh, no, just me. Okay. It looks like a snow remover almost, like it could clear anything out of its way with like a sledged front. And then it's intended to, if it can't target individuals, it's intended just to be like a mine on wheels. It'll drive to where it needs to explode and then it'll explode. And then you have versions like the Cargo 2, which is essentially quite similar to the drones that you see for sale for consumer purposes. You know, the ones that everyone seems to be flying around neighborhoods these days. And then you have the US Predator drone, which looks like a jet plane. There are so many different configurations for so many different purposes. I'm really interested in the commonalities between these, because while I do think that there are specific concerns that will align with the specific autonomous weapon systems, I'm trying to produce what will essentially be more of a high level guide for engineers generally, by giving them a general understanding of what are the commonalities between these systems. They're all going to have some form of visual identification system. They're all going to have some form of mobility, whether it's the weird little dog robots that they've got in San Francisco, or a drone that can fly, or something on wheels like a mini tank. So yeah, I guess the answer to you is I'm going to be looking at what these various weapons have in common more than I'll be looking at a specific case study, but I absolutely will be looking at what's currently happening in the Israel Hamas conflict, because that is a concern of mine as well.
Yeah, thank you very much.
That answers your question.
No, it was great for me as someone who is a non-expert. It was really spoken in my language, so thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for your question.
Workshop. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I just had a really wonderful time listening to the presentations. So thank you. My question was for Alexandra as well, and this is just my curiosity as you're looking at like the locus of international law and also AWS and AI. I was just curious, like, what do you think about international law's capacity to sort of adapt to address kind of the rapid technological development that's happening in this area? With all the research that's done, this is not like a static system. It'll evolve and gain additional capabilities.
Thank you very much for your question. That's actually a concern that's been discussed a lot in international legal jurisprudence and academia. There's something called the law of the horse, which was a journal article written about this very topic, and the idea that when the horse came along, was there a law of the horse when you're using them for transportation? So I don't think there's going to be a new global treaty, say, banning or severely restricting the use of autonomous weapon systems, particularly since major players in this field have shown that they are very interested in continuing to develop and deploy them. But instead, I think that there's a wealth of international legal precedent to allow us to still address these issues, because only the means and methods of war are novel. The war itself is not novel. The role of engineers in facilitating war and war crimes is not novel. We have a jurisprudential history of being able to look at novel events and still find these same relationships that we've already, and these same crimes and processes that already exist within international legal jurisprudence and scholarship. So I'm hopeful that we won't need a brand new law of the autonomous weapon system in order to address what I think are some very real concerns. But I understand why it's become such a hot topic, because we have successfully banned weapons in the past. There's currently a ban on blinding laser weapons. There's a ban on landmines. There's a ban on atomic weapons. I don't see it happening in this instance, and I think we have the tools to deal with it, or at least I'm very hopeful that we have the tools to deal with it within the existing ecosystem, so to speak. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. I was just curious as
No, anytime.
your expert opinion. So thank you.
Oh, not an expert. Thank you.
Oh, there's Nell. Nell has a question.
Oh, go ahead.
I have 4 questions.
A lot.
I'll just start with Nawang. I'm also from India, and TB is stigmatized a lot in the Indian population, where people don't want to talk about TB. But here you said that in the Tibetan population, TB is talked about very casually. So have you thought about the link between that, the casual, the nonchalant way of talking about TB in that community versus the rest of the Indian population where TB is a hush-hush topic?
Yeah, I actually didn't think about that now, because I know that TB stigma does exist within the Tibetan community, but that's something that I didn't consider. How in most cases people are hush-hush about their TB diagnosis. I'm not sure actually about this. I think something that I have to explore further on, because I think it is interesting that the openness isn't exactly, hey, I have TB. It's not in that kind of thing, but it's more so like, oh, so and so has TB. But we don't go further. We don't go deeper in understanding.
I think that would
I feel like maybe there's no space to keep it in, because first of all, we're a really close-knit community, and because it's so common within the close-knit community, maybe there's no space to hide, in a sense. But I do know that TB stigma does exist, but to what extent and how it manifests is something that I do need to explore further on. In my close-knit I don't mean everyone is super close to each other. I mean, in India, we're kind of in different areas of India, and we're in settlement camps. So you kind of get to know what's happening in other person's in life. But still we're a small group. So I think maybe that allows for the openness to happen. But yeah, that's it. Thank you for the
Should I ask? Or
Would you like to ask another question?
yeah,
Yeah, sure, go ahead. I think we're okay.
You talked about decentralization and that affecting the education policy in Ghana. Could you elaborate on that a bit? Because most times you hear about decentralization being a good thing, right? Is it a good thing in Ghana, or is it backfiring?
In theory, it's supposed to be a good thing. So, in terms of infrastructure development and school development, that's where the municipalities and the districts are supposed to shine. So we have something called the District Assembly Common Fund. It's a minimum of 5% from the consolidated fund that's allocated to the districts, and it's supposed to go towards development of social services, specifically education, roads, markets, all of that stuff. A minimum of 5% in the context of things is not a lot, especially when you consider the macroeconomic environment now. So that's one thing. Other contributions to the District Assembly Common Fund are like investments of the money that's already there and grants and all of that stuff. So you can see how in wealthier districts, if people are making more donations and there's more development of the schools in those areas. So aside the District Assembly Common Fund, we also have the Ghana Education Trust Fund, which allocates money from the government's revenue as well into education. And that's a more national kind of framework that goes directly towards supporting fees, supporting scholarships and all of that stuff. And the district's also supposed to have a say in that as well. But the thing about Get Fund is extremely political. It's very hard to get a scholarship if you don't know someone. And there are cases where even when you get a scholarship, like the district recommends you get a scholarship, you go to the secretariat and they say, okay, an extra 100,000 cedis before you get access to a scholarship. And it's like, what's the point of paying to get a scholarship? You know, so those are the kind of issues happening. It's a lack of financing and decrease in financing. Another thing with Get Fund is Get Fund's allocation has been reduced significantly over the past 4 years. So I think about now it's about 8% of the national budget, which is really small for something that's supposed to help support low income and impoverished students as well. So decentralization in theory is supposed to be a good thing, but then those are some of the issues facing some of the schools and the assemblies as well.
Maybe I could just follow up on that question. So, and you also talked about, certain schools collapsing. And so to what extent does that centralization, decentralization, what are the factors that might, poses barriers to addressing some of those issues?
I think one of the biggest things is privatization, especially since in theory, again, the districts are supposed to be responsible for development of the school. So that means the district is supposed to seek out contractors, is supposed to seek out stakeholders who collaborate public-private partnerships to help develop the schools. And when I interned with Africa Education Watch, we had a stakeholder research validation meeting, and something they mentioned was the contractors would get the contracts, they would put up a shoddy building and then abandon the project basically because the district is paying you still at the end of the day. So I think the public-private partnership has to be evaluated, or the extent to which it's effective has to be evaluated, especially now, again, the macroeconomic environment is really bad and private stakeholders are not as incentivized to contribute to school development in that sense as well. Another thing is just there's a very poor maintenance culture, and there's an enduring impact of British zoning laws actually on the development of infrastructure in schools. So when I go back to Ghana, I always tell my mom that we build schools and they look like prisons because they literally look like prisons. And they're not built with children in mind. They're not built with children's interests at heart. And the infrastructure is also not designed with children at heart. So I think there's also a kind of philosophical discursive thing that manifests materially in how schools are built and how they're maintained as well.
Fascinating. James, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just have some general thoughts. I mean, first of all, I really enjoyed just listening to each of the four presentations, and um, obviously each person is at a different stage in the evolution of their research, and also their learning about how to do research. It was really nice to see that, right, and to see people, each of you, move in your own way on that particular journey. And so I really enjoyed the presentations, and just some general sort of thoughts and comments. You know, I think on autonomous weapon systems, you know, there's a whole bunch of questions that come to mind, and just to me the most obvious is, how is, for example, you know, the Cargo 2, how is that different from a cruise missile? And how is any weapon or any weapons delivery system specifically different today relative to prior historic precedents? And so, you know, think about like a cannon and a cannonball. You know, well, somebody has to design that and also build it, and then somebody has to put the cannonball in the cannon, and then someone has to light the fuse. So where is in that life cycle method, or that life cycle of the cannon, where is responsibility for the use of the weapon, and how is that different from autonomous weapon systems? So that, like, I think that's a really important sort of fundamental question. And then I also think that you know, I would ask, you know, for kind of a deeper, and I recognize obviously you have 10 minutes, so, like, you know, I get it. You can't say everything in 10 minutes, but the focus on engineers, why is that your focus? And what is the argument that you're making about the culpability and the responsibility of engineers, as opposed to soldiers, as opposed to politicians, as opposed to institutions like, you know, York University, you know, that, you know, participate in the creation of the knowledge base around artificial intelligence and so on. So what specifically is the argument around, and I'm not saying that there isn't an argument, I'm just saying, what is the argument, right? Specifically around the culpability / responsibility of engineers, as opposed to other entities or other sources in that life cycle of a particular weapon. So I mean, that's just a, you know, a quick off the cuff set of questions. And then on water quality, I thought that was a great presentation and a really nice detailed presentation. And there were a lot of questions, you know, come to mind. And so, for example, just, I mean, I hope I have the dates and the numbers correct, but you decided to exclude all data except March, April, and May because the other data was not reliable, and yet one of your primary questions is seasonality, right? And the implications or the impact of seasonality on water quality. So you're choosing literally one season, right? And then you're trying to make generalizations about seasonality. And can you actually do that? Say again? But yeah, exactly. Yeah. So can you do that? And is that right? Is that wrong? You know, all of that was a very important question. And then the other was that, and this I think is a general comment, you know, for everyone. You know, global health is we struggle with this all the time. You know, we as you know, the professors in a program in global health. I mean, what is global health? Is it a discipline? Is it a practice? You know, is it a unique academic entity and or discipline practice? Does it have a specific methodology? Does it have a specific viewpoint, right? And these are open questions. You know, these are not determined. There's no answer, not yet an answer to those questions. And our effort here at York is really to try to bring to bear a critical social science perspective on global health, right? And to bring that into this ongoing kind of emergent debate about what is global health, right? But that doesn't mean that we ignore basic science, right? And when we talk about transdisciplinarity, it's actually transdisciplinarity. So it's not, well, social science applied to, right? It's transdisciplinarity. It's basic science and social science applied to. And so it's really important, I think, that now whether you're a science, a quote unquote basic scientist, or somewhere close to that, with all respect, engineer. No, that was not a shot. That was not a shot. That was a sort of a, you're okay. Whether it's that, or whether it's clinical medicine, or whether it's basic science medicine, discovery medicine, it's very important to not, especially for people in global health, to not to do two things. Number one, actually communicate very explicitly the health question that you are trying to address, right? So, for example, water quality. So why is copper important? Why is copper in water important?
Oh, I did have those slides, but you gave me 10 minutes.
No, I understand. I'm just general questions. Why are these, what are the health impacts? And it doesn't have to be like these long, detailed PhD dissertations on copper and neurological development, right? It just the question. Well, copper has impact on neurodevelopment, and if the levels are high, well, then it will affect learning and whatever. That's simple. Why is tuberculosis important? And why are the clinical aspects of tuberculosis important? And I would just say that, for example, you cannot possibly meaningfully explore the social science aspects of tuberculosis without a very clear and basic understanding of the clinical aspects of tuberculosis. And it is literally the lived experience of disease, of physical disease, that defines the social lived experience and the reaction to it, right? So stigma and exactly the two things that the two perspectives you were talking about, the quote unquote Indian perspective versus the Tibetan perspective within a broader Indian context. So it's very important, to take truly a transdisciplinary perspective and to actually express that, right? Almost in every single presentation, so because it's a communicative, part of what we're trying to do when we talk about global health, and especially at this university, part of what we're trying to do is communicate a deeper, richer, more nuanced, I don't know how else to put it, conception of global health, right? And it's not that, well, we're doing the social science bit, or we're doing the engineering bit, or we're trying to bring a particular transdisciplinary perspective to global health. And that's a communicative kind of process, right? So it's really important that when we do, that we try to communicate that, and we do it, not from the comfort of our discipline, but from actually the discomfort of trying to communicate that, to try to bring a broader, truly transdisciplinary perspective. And I think, I can see how each of you in your presentations are really struggling to do that. And I just want to really encourage you, that is part of the research, and don't be afraid of that, and continue to kind of struggle with it, and try to articulate, that transdisciplinarity. There you are. Yeah. That's it. Those are really my big thoughts and comments, but I really, really enjoyed the presentations, and I think we made good choices.
Yeah, and just to add, James, I think that's your unique contribution, because that blending of the disciplines, it's, I mean, it's harder to do in a
It's
sense.
really hard.
But it's that, going back and forth that adds new meaning. And you can uncover, you know, that's where discoveries happen when at the transdisciplinary, because you're thinking in different ways. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, I'll thank you for those great comments, Jim. And most of all, thank you to all of our presenters today and all of you as graduate students going through. It's, you know, thinking back on graduate studies, it's both a challenging and exciting time. And, you know, we look forward to your contributions as you go through your programs.
Yeah.
So thank you.
It's great.